There is a language older than words. It lives in the cut of a jacket, in the number of buttons fastened on a military tunic, in the deliberate choice of whether a man walks into a room as a soldier or as a statesman. Empires have risen and collapsed not because of what was said at the negotiating table, but because of what was worn to it. Because somewhere, in the ancient architecture of human power, we learned that the body is a billboard, and the truly powerful never waste a single inch of it. General Asim Munir understood this. The world, distracted by headlines and ticker tape noise, mostly did not. Let me be precise. When Pakistan's Chief of Army Staff, General Syed Asim Munir, the most powerful man in a nation of 240 million souls, the quiet architect of Pakistani statecraft, the man who holds the nuclear codes and the institutional memory of the most complex military establishment in the Islamic world, when this man received the Iranian president, he appeared in full military uniform, every medal in its place, every star on his shoulder deliberate. The khaki pressed to a geometry that spoke of discipline, of hierarchy, of the Pakistani state presenting itself as a fortress rather than a doorstep. The uniform said, "We are a military power. We are a sovereign state. We are not supplicants." But when the American delegation arrived, when Washington's envoy stepped onto Pakistani soil in the long shadow of geopolitical recalibration, Asim Munir wore a suit, a civilian suit, dark, elegant, understated in the way that only truly confident men can afford to be understated. And in that single sartorial choice, Pakistan told America something it had been trying to say for years through press conferences and diplomatic cables and strained communiques, something it had never quite managed to articulate with the necessary clarity. It said, "We see you as partners, not commanders. We meet you as equals. We are not a military problem for you to manage. We are a state, with civilian aspirations, with democratic ambitions, with a future that runs through commerce and connectivity rather than combat operations." The world looked, but it did not see. To understand why a suit matters, you must first understand what a uniform means in Pakistan. The Pakistani military is not simply an institution. It is a civilization within a civilization. It has its own courts, its own hospitals, its own housing societies, its own media ecosystem, its own theory of nationhood. When a Pakistani general appears in uniform before a foreign dignitary, he is not merely identifying his profession. He is invoking the full weight of an establishment that has governed, directly or indirectly, this country for more than half of its existence. He is saying, the real Pakistan is here, in this khaki, in these stars, in this posture. That is what Iran received. And Iran, to its credit, understood the message perfectly. Tehran and Rawalpindi have always spoken to each other in the grammar of institutions rather than ideologies. The relationship between Pakistan and Iran is one of the most misread in South Asian geopolitics, perpetually filtered through a Sunni-Shia lens by analysts who cannot conceive that two states might pragmatically coexist despite theological differences. But Rawalpindi and Tehran have managed exactly this for decades. They share a border. They share the problem of Balakh insurgency, one on each side of the Durand Line's extension. They share a suspicion of American maximalism. They share the experience of sanctions, of isolation, of being labeled and filed by Washington into categories that serve Washington's needs rather than their own complex realities. When Asim Munir wore his uniform for Iran, he was speaking to a fellow sovereign, a proud ancient civilization that would understand the language of martial dignity, a state that itself projects power through the symbolic vocabulary of the Revolutionary Guard, through the carefully choreographed processions of the Quds Force, through the deliberate display of missile arsenals at precisely calibrated moments. Uniform for Iran meant, we respect your institutional vocabulary. We speak your language. We are not embarrassed by power. But America is a different conversation entirely. America is the country that invented the illusion of civilian supremacy so thoroughly that it almost believed the illusion itself. A nation where generals retire and write memoirs and appear on cable news but are, in theory, at the constitutional command of elected civilians, even when the reality is more complicated, more layered, more tangled in the deep institutional webs of the Pentagon and Langley and the labyrinthine corridors of the intelligence community. America presents itself to the world in the language of democracy, of civilian government, of the rule of law. And so America, when it meets a foreign military chief in a suit, reads something familiar, something comfortable, something that says, we can do business. The suit Asim Munir wore was not a capitulation. Understand that deeply. It was not submission. It was not the wardrobe choice of a man anxious to please. Those who know Asim Munir's psychological profile, and enough has been written, enough has leaked through the cracks of briefings and background conversations and the careful observations of those who have sat across from him, know that this is not a man who performs anxiety. This is a man who served in military intelligence for decades, who ran the ISI, who was removed as ISI chief by a sitting prime minister and then, in a reversal that still carries the scent of institutional warfare, returned to dominate the entire military establishment. This is a man who has lived inside the world of signals and codes and hidden meanings since before most of his current critics were politically conscious. He knew exactly what he was doing. The suit said, I am willing to meet you in your conceptual framework. I understand that America conducts its foreign policy through the grammar of civilian institutions. I am presenting myself to you not as the jailer of a failing state, not as the military guardian of a client relationship, but as the senior figure of a sovereign nation that has made a considered choice to engage with you on terms that acknowledge your preferred idiom of statecraft. This is the difference between translation and surrender. Asim Munir was not surrendering, he was translating. There is a Cold War parallel here that the serious student of geopolitics cannot afford to ignore. In the years between 1947 and the Soviet collapse, Pakistan occupied a peculiar and lucrative position in the American strategic imagination, a Muslim-majority nation, geographically positioned at the crossroads of South Asia, Central Asia, and the Middle East, with a professional military, nuclear ambitions, and a deep institutional hostility to Soviet expansion. Washington needed Rawalpindi, and Rawalpindi needed Washington's dollars, its weapons, its F-16s and Stinger missiles, and the kind of diplomatic cover that allows a state to survive in a dangerous neighborhood. The relationship was never equal. It was never meant to be. It was transactional in the most clinical sense of the word, a mutual exploitation that each side occasionally mistook for friendship. Pakistan played America during the Soviet-Afghan War with a sophistication that history has still not fully credited. The ISI channeled billions in American funding to the Afghan Mujahideen while simultaneously pursuing its own strategic vision for a post-Soviet Afghanistan, one that would provide Rawalpindi with strategic depth. A doctrine so controversial, so contested, so catastrophically consequential that it ultimately helped give birth to the Taliban and set in motion a chain of events that culminated in September 2001 and the 2 decades of war that followed. Pakistan got its strategic depth. It also got drone strikes on its own soil and a relationship with America that curdled into something almost unrecognizable. The lesson Rawalpindi drew from those decades was not that it had been wrong to play America. The lesson was that it had been insufficiently careful about managing the aftermath. And here, in the choice of a suit, we see the attempt to begin a new chapter with the institutional memory of the old one fully intact. The tarmac at Nur Khan Air Base at night has a particular quality. If you have ever stood near the flight line of a major military installation after dark, when the operational aircraft are tucked into their hardened shelters and the administrative lights of the base cast long amber shadows across the concrete, you understand that this is a place where the gap between ceremony and menace is exceptionally thin. The smell of jet fuel never fully dissipates. It soaks into the concrete, into the fabric of the buildings, into the institutional memory of the place itself. Military air bases smell like latent power, like the stored kinetic energy of a civilization that has decided at some fundamental level that force is the ultimate argument. When American delegations land in Pakistan, they land at this kind of place, and there is always a moment, brief, almost imperceptible, when the American side adjusts to the reality that they are guests here, that the men in uniform surrounding them are not an honor guard in the decorative sense, but an honor guard in the operational sense. That the quiet efficiency of the Pakistani military protocol is not performed for their comfort. It is performed because this is simply how this institution does everything, with precision, with hierarchy, with an economy of motion that suggests decades of institutional confidence. The handshake on that tarmac, or in whatever reception room the protocol eventually dictated, was not simply 2 men making contact. It was 2 institutional histories making contact. Two theories of power, briefly occupying the same physical space, each sizing up the other with the practiced subtlety of entities that have been doing this dance for 75 years. And standing there in his suit, not his uniform, his suit, Asim Munir was saying something that no press release could say, something that no joint statement could capture. Pakistan has options. Pakistan has made a choice today, and that choice is to meet you on ground that we have selected, in a language that we have chosen to deploy, for reasons that are entirely our own. In the high-stakes world of power, silence is the loudest noise, and what Pakistan chose not to say during this period is as revelatory as what it chose to say. Pakistan did not issue a joint statement with Iran that explicitly criticized American sanctions. Pakistan did not repeat its earlier, somewhat more inflammatory rhetoric about the Gaza conflict in any official communique timed to the American visit. Pakistan's civilian government, that increasingly important, increasingly visible civilian government that the suit was partly designed to reference, maintained a studied neutrality on several regional questions that Washington watches obsessively. This is not coincidence. This is calibration. This is a state that has been reading American mood music since before it had satellite channels to do so, and that has developed over generations of diplomatic practice an almost preternatural ability to know which silences are golden and which will cost it in the next budget cycle. Because the money matters. Let us not be naive about this. Geopolitics is philosophy wearing the mask of economics. The IMF program that Pakistan so desperately needs, the structural support, the balance of payments relief, the breathing room from an external debt situation that periodically threatens to become existential. None of it happens without American acquiescence. Washington does not need to actively support Pakistan at the IMF. It merely needs to not oppose it. And the difference between American opposition and American acquiescence at Bretton Woods institutions is measured in practice in tens of billions of dollars and in the difference between a managed economic crisis and an unmanaged one. The suit understood this. The suit was also, therefore, a financial communication, a signal sent to the specific audience within the American establishment that controls these levers, the Treasury, the State Department's Economic Bureau, the NSC's South Asia Directorate, that Pakistan was reorienting its self-presentation toward the register that makes American institutional support more likely. Not certain, not guaranteed, but more likely. That is the art of statecraft at this level. You do not secure outcomes, you improve probabilities. There is a school of thought, prevalent in certain Pakistani intellectual circles, in the online commentariat that has grown enormously influential since the rise of Imran Khan's political movement, that views every such gesture toward America as a betrayal, as a submission, as evidence that the establishment remains, at its core, a creature of American patronage, unable to imagine a Pakistan that charts its own course. This school of thought is not entirely wrong. The history it points to is real. The dependence it describes has been structurally debilitating. The way in which American pressure has, at various moments, bent Pakistani policy in directions that served Washington rather than Islamabad, this is documented, this is verifiable, this is part of the living memory of this institution. But this school of thought makes an error that analysts of power frequently make when they are more interested in moral clarity than strategic accuracy. It confuses engagement with subordination. It cannot conceive of the possibility that a state might engage with a powerful patron while simultaneously maintaining a parallel set of relationships with China, with the Gulf, with Turkey, with the SCO, with the emerging architecture of multipolar institutions that provide genuine hedging capacity, that the suit, in other words, might be a tactic deployed by a strategist rather than a costume worn by a puppet. The evidence suggests the latter interpretation is more accurate. Pakistan's relationship with China has deepened, not weakened, during this same period of American re-engagement. CPEC, for all its implementation challenges, for all the debt renegotiations and the security concerns about Chinese workers and the political turbulence that has occasionally disrupted specific projects, CPEC remains structurally intact as a long-term vision. Pakistan's military-to-military relationship with Beijing has expanded in ways that would have been unthinkable in the 1990s. The PL-15 air-to-air missile, the J-10C fighters, the naval cooperation in the Arabian Sea. These are not the portfolio scenario decisions of a state that has abandoned strategic autonomy. These are the investments of a state that is, in its own imperfect, resource-constrained, domestically turbulent way, trying to become genuinely non-aligned rather than superficially so. The suit for America, the uniform for Iran. And somewhere in Beijing, a very different message is being calibrated very carefully. A message delivered perhaps not in clothing, but in the language of infrastructure contracts and military technology transfers, and the quiet institutional embrace of a partnership that Pakistan regards as, in Xi Jinping's formulation, higher than mountains and deeper than oceans. The real strategic picture is not a binary. It is a triangle at minimum, possibly a polygon. But let us return to the moment itself, because beyond the geopolitics, beyond the theory, there is something profoundly human happening here that the purely analytical framework misses. Asim Munir is not merely a chess piece moving on a board of great power competition. He is a man, a deeply, intensely complicated man, who has spent his entire adult life inside an institution that simultaneously lionizes and consumes its best practitioners. An institution that offers its generals enormous power and then occasionally destroys them. That makes them kingmakers and then sometimes makes them prisoners. That asks everything of them: their youth, their family time, their capacity for moral certainty in ambiguous situations, and in return offers them the only thing that institution believes is worth offering: significance. The significance of the suit. The significance of being the man who decides which register to speak in, who decides, on a given morning, in a given anteroom, with a given foreign delegation waiting, whether Pakistan presents itself as a fortress or as a partner, whether the message today is we are sovereign or we are engaged, whether the subtext is do not underestimate us or we are ready to do business. This is an enormous amount of power for any individual to hold. And the weight of it, if you close your eyes and really try to feel the texture of that room, the temperature of that diplomatic encounter, the 100 invisible calculations running simultaneously behind the composed, unreadable face of a man trained for decades to be unreadable, the weight of it is staggering, because every choice has a cost. Every suit unworn is a uniform that speaks a different sentence. Every relationship deepened with one power is a relationship that potentially complicates an engagement with another. The map of Pakistani interests is not a clean, well-lit diagram. It is a fever chart. Peaks and valleys, crises and recoveries, moments of genuine strategic clarity, followed by periods of such intense domestic turbulence that the very machinery of foreign policy seems to seize up entirely. And through all of it, through the economy convulsing, through the civilian government struggling to maintain basic coherence, through the judicial battles and the political imprisonments and the media crackdowns and the relentless pressures of an inflation rate that is slowly crushing the Pakistani middle class. Through all of this, the army continues. The army decides. The army wears a suit today and a uniform tomorrow, and in that choosing tells the world something about who Pakistan is and what Pakistan wants. Let me be precise about what this moment tells us about the near future. Pakistan is attempting something that has historically been very difficult to pull off: a simultaneous rebalancing of its relationships with the United States and China without sacrificing the depth of either, while also managing a deteriorating relationship with India that occasionally threatens to become kinetic, while also navigating an Afghan border that has become a source of regular terrorist infiltration, while also maintaining the Gulf relationships that fund the remittances that keep its economy afloat, while also trying to present a civilian face to the world that reassures investors and international institutions. This is, to put it plainly, an enormous ask. States with far greater resources, far greater institutional stability, far greater economic buffers have failed to execute this kind of multi-directional rebalancing act. Pakistan is attempting it while its foreign currency reserves have, at various recent points, barely covered 3 weeks of imports. While its debt servicing consumes more than half of federal revenue, while a former prime minister sits in a prison cell that has become, for millions of his followers, a symbol of institutional overreach, while the ordinary Pakistani, the taxi driver in Karachi, the farmer in Punjab, the young engineer in Lahore who dreams of emigrating but hasn't yet given up on his country, watches the purchasing power of his salary evaporate and asks, with a mixture of exhaustion and fury, what exactly is all of this strategic maneuvering doing for me? The suit doesn't answer that question. No suit ever does. History will record this period, these first years of the third decade of the 21st century, as the moment when the post-Cold War world order finally, irreversibly, confessed its own incompleteness. When American unipolarity, always more asserted than actual, began its long retreat into a nostalgia for itself. When China's rise forced every state in the world to make calculations that the old architecture of alliances and institutions wasn't designed to accommodate. When the Global South, that vast, complicated, perpetually underestimated collection of states that had spent decades being acted upon by great powers, began, haltingly, imperfectly, often contradictorily, to act for itself. Pakistan is part of this story. Not a passive part, not a footnote, but a genuinely consequential actor in a region that sits at the geographic intersection of every major strategic anxiety of the 21st century. The energy routes, the nuclear proliferation concerns, the extremism vectors, the demographic pressures, the climate vulnerabilities, the water crises. Pakistan is the country that the world cannot afford to ignore and cannot quite manage to understand. And so it does what powerful states have always done when dealing with entities they cannot fully comprehend. It tries to manage them, to frame them, to reduce their complexity to a set of policy variables that can be optimized from a position of geographic and financial distance. The suit was Pakistan's answer to being managed. You want to frame me? I'll choose the frame. You want to manage me? I'll choose the vocabulary of the meeting. You see a military state in perpetual crisis? I'll show you a statesman in a well-cut jacket who speaks your language fluently, who knows your institutional anxieties intimately, and who has come to this room not as a supplicant, but as a sovereign, with his own agenda, his own timeline, his own theory of where this relationship needs to go. The world is reconfiguring itself, not with the dramatic rupture of wars or the clean clarity of ideological revolutions, but with the quiet daily accumulation of choices, of bilateral agreements signed or not signed, of which delegation gets a uniform and which gets a suit, of which multilateral forum gets Pakistan's enthusiastic participation and which gets its studied ambiguity, of whether the pipeline to Iran gets built or remains a geopolitical instrument of permanent potential, of whether the CPEC extension to Afghanistan happens or remains a vision in a PowerPoint, of whether Pakistan finds a way to normalize with India, or whether the next crisis, the next surgical strike, the next Pulwama, the next Uri triggers an escalation that the entire region will spend a generation recovering from. These choices are being made now, in rooms we cannot see, by men who have chosen today to wear a suit. The texture of that fabric, the quiet weight of civilian cloth against the skin of a general, is the texture of a decision being made. Not just about a meeting, about a direction, about who Pakistan believes itself to be in this reconfiguring world, about whose partnership it values, and in what register it chooses to express that value. Protocol is language. And this particular sentence, spoken in dark wool and a firm handshake in the amber light of a reception room in Rawalpindi, this sentence is still being translated. The translation will take years. The consequences will take decades. And the world, which looked but did not see, will one day look back at this moment, at this small, enormous choice of cloth over khaki, and finally understand what was being said. Pakistan was not choosing a patron. Pakistan was choosing a posture. And in the 21st century, posture is everything. The strongest walls in history were never built of stone. They were built of perception, of the careful, deliberate management of what others believe about your strength, your intentions, and your willingness to act. Pakistan has spent 75 years building walls of perception. The suit was just the latest brick.